Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
So before we begin with today's witness, I'd just like to say that yesterday the inquiry received over 700 documents from Post Office Limited that are potentially relevant to issues to be explored in Phase 3. This disclosure includes documents said to be provided to members of NBSC to assist in dealing with calls for assistance from sub-postmasters. The inquiry considers that the vast majority of these documents should have been provided further to a Rule 9 request sent on the 18th of February 2022. We have considered carefully whether to seek to postpone hearing some of the witnesses this week until such time as those documents have been fully reviewed and disclosed to core participants. However, we propose not to do so. This is because the witness can speak to a number of other issues, and those issues should be investigated now. Your legal team will continue to review the newly disclosed documents and provide them where they are relevant to core participants in due course. We propose keeping under consideration whether it's necessary to arrange additional sitting days to hear oral evidence on those issues raised in that disclosure. The inquiry can, of course, recall any witnesses heard this week to speak to those documents should it become necessary.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. I think you probably know that I was informed of this state of affairs, to be precise, at about 7:05 last evening. So I've had the opportunity to reflect upon the course of action which you propose overnight. And in short, I agree with it. I don't think anything would be served by adjourning for a short period and asking witnesses who have made themselves ready to give evidence not to do so. I think the course that you suggest is preferable, and so that's what we'll do.
Thank you very much. In light of that, can I please call Mr. Shaun Turner?
Yeah.
Repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth. Thank you. Sit down.
Thank you. Can you give your full name, please?
Yeah, Shaun Turner.
Mr. Turner, you should have in front of you a witness statement dated the 13th of January of 2023.
I do.
It has the URN WITN 046400100. If I could ask you to turn to page 91 of that statement.
Yes.
Is that your signature there?
It is.
Thank you. And can you confirm that that statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
It is.
Thank you. I know that there are a couple of areas that you'd like to expand upon or clarify in due course. We don't need to address those now. We can address them shortly. That statement is going into evidence, so I'm not going to ask you about every single detail contained in that witness statement. The questions I'll ask today will be supplementary, although I'm going to start by asking you a bit about your background. Now, that takes up several pages of your witness statement because you've held a lot of positions and a lot of those positions have quite long titles. So I'm going to try and go through a few of those to assist the inquiry with a little bit more detail. But it's clear that you were employed by the Post Office since 1996. Did you hold any other job before that, or was that your first significant employment?
Apart from part-time work, it was essentially the first job that I picked up after university.
Thank you. And you say in your statement that between 1996 and 1998 you worked in the North East Region Help Desk and Customer Care. Can you tell us, that was pre-Horizon.
Yes.
What did working on the help desk pre-Horizon involve?
It involved taking calls from branches and at that time from also post office customers, resolving queries, resolving customer complaints.
And you're at that stage familiar with balancing in the paper method?
Yes.
In 1999, you became an NBSC analyst, and you're the first witness from the NBSC. So can you please tell us what was the NBSC?
So the NBSC was the Network Business Support Centre. It was set up in line with the Horizon rollout. So the idea was, as branches migrated onto Horizon, they would stop contacting their regional helpline and they would start contacting the NBSC, and the NBSC would then become the helpline for Horizon branches, fulfilling the same function as the regional helplines did.
I think we've heard in previous evidence about first line of support, second line of support. Can you tell us briefly where you fit into the mix of different levels of support?
Yes, I was aligned with the second line of support, which was called Tier 2, which was operated by Post Office. So that was the advisors that dealt with the more complicated inquiries. The first tier was actually not managed by Post Office. It was managed by another part of Royal Mail Group called SSL, and they had their own sort of management structure, team leaders, and they dealt with the sort of more basic inquiries. Anything that was more complicated or required sort of longer diagnosis would be passed to the Tier 2 team.
So if I were a sub-postmaster or an assistant and I wanted to speak to somebody about a problem with Horizon, who would I call in the first instance?
It depends what the problem was. If it was sort of operational procedures or navigation, it would be the NBSC, and in the first instance that would be the Tier 1 on NBSC, and if they couldn't deal with it, it went on to Tier 2. If it was system-related issues, your printer wasn't working, something like that, it would be HSD, which was managed by Fujitsu.
Is that the Horizon Service Desk?
Yes.
Thank you. And how would I know which to call?
There were communications to branches that made it clear that if it is a system problem, then you ring this help desk. If it is a navigation or operational kind of inquiry, then you ring the NBSC. That wasn't always followed. We did get a lot of branches ringing the wrong help desk, and that resulted in, at times, transfers between the help desk where we had to reroute callers.
Were there policies in place that clearly defined the roles of the NBSC and the Horizon Service Desk vis-a-vis one another?
I don't remember any policy documents as such. I remember communications, and in the materials that went out to branches that was made clear. And I think from a contractual perspective, from what I understood, it was quite clear from a contractual perspective what the sort of delineation of those two help desks' scope and responsibility was.
Let's say if I had a bug with my Horizon terminal, who would I call?
If you thought that there was a problem with the system, then you would call HSD.
And if I had a problem balancing, but I didn't know what was causing it, who would I call?
NBSC in the first instance.
And you said there was some confusion between the two by postmasters. Can you describe that a little bit for us?
Yeah, I think it was just general. This was new to postmasters. There was a learning curve. They were trying to deal with a lot, trying to learn a lot in the branches, and sometimes they just rang the wrong help desk and needed to be rerouted. But there were other kind of queries that may involve or may require the interaction with both help desks. So, for example, if you were trying to produce your trading statement, your cash account, and your printer broke, you would need to report that to the HSD, but you may also need to report to the NBSC that your cash account would be delayed, for example.
And was there ever a single point of contact, or would you, the sub-postmaster, have to make the contact with both?
We would generally the help desk that dealt with the call first would deal with their bit of the call and then transfer the call across to the other help desk to deal with the final bit.
And again, in relation to policies that existed, was there something that set that out, that the first helpline would be the one that dealt with the problem or took leadership or ownership of it?
Not to my recollection.
Can you tell us, at 1999, what was your role at the NBSC?
So in 1999, I was in late 1999, I became an MBSC incident analyst. So that was a role, one of two roles that were attached to Tier 2 in the MBSC, and we had accountability for building reports to monitor calls coming into the help desk, and we had a link to the problem management team if there were issues that we saw kind of repeating.
Would you speak directly with branches in that role?
Not typically, no. I'm not saying that that never happened, but typically it would be the advisors or sometimes the team leaders, and they would sometimes bring issues to us, but not typically during the course of my role as an incident analyst, no.
So your role was principally analysing trends and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, it did perform a sort of ancillary support function for the advisors because their team leader may not always be about. So, any manager could be approached with queries from advisors. So I'm not saying that there was no interaction with postmasters, but I was just saying it would be rare compared to a team leaders who would have day-to-day interactions with postmasters.
September 2001, you became Network Performance Analyst. What, in simple terms, did that role involve?
So I moved out of the MBSC at this point. This was a role, again, principally a role related to data and analysis, and this was looking at sort of conformance related data. So this may be errors that the branch was making and trying to build outbound call campaigns to speak to branches about those errors and ultimately reduce them.
You moved on to a banking project before becoming Network Conformance and Capacity Manager in 2003.
Yes.
I think in that role you looked again at error rates and conformance within branches to prioritise calls. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
Can you tell us briefly what that involved?
That was essentially a rerun of the earlier role. It was just moved into the MBSC. So there was a separate team. In 2001, there was a separate team that made those outbound calls, which was from Chesterfield. But when I moved into the Network Conformance Capacity Manager role, that work was moved back to the MBSC. It was actually undertaken by the Tier 2 advisors, one of the teams. It was kind of rotated round the teams each week. And also that role, we did sort of capacity planning, so we were sort of analysing call arrival patterns and trying to make sure that we had the relevant cover on Tier 2 of the help desk to meet the call volumes.
In 2005, you became Network Coordination Advisor. Again, very briefly, can you tell us what that role involved?
Yeah, so it was initially a project role. When I first moved into it, there was some reorganisation at that time in the retail structure, and what they were trying to do at that stage was traditionally post offices had a retail network manager that was connected to each branch, and this piece of work was to have a much more kind of distinct separation between sales and service. So the sort of on-the-ground resources would be focused on the top sales branches, and the service-related issues, things like ordering date stamps, that kind of thing that traditionally gone to the retail network manager, were kind of rerouted centrally through the MBSC, and if they couldn't resolve it, it would go on to the service teams who would fulfill a kind of reactive capability of going out to branches to resolve issues. So it started off with that piece of transformation work, building the processes, developing the processes with MBSC, and then it morphed into a team that was essentially attached to that service function and was responsible for managing relationships with other business stakeholders. So, for example, product and branch accounting in Chesterfield, the problem management team, and we would get sort of issues raised to us from the service managers, and we would take those up with our contacts in those various teams.
After that role, you moved to several different roles. Is it right to say that they were predominantly data-related roles, analysing data? Is that your particular area of expertise?
Yeah, I think that's a fair categorisation of the roles that I held from sort of 2010 to late 2015. They were data-related roles, and they were predominantly concerned with conformance and compliance specifically.
And that involves drawing trends together from various pieces of data to see how Post Office can perform better?
Yeah, and this is mainly to do with, or at the time it was mainly to do with sort of mails compliance specifically. In 2012 we signed the mails distribution agreement with Royal Mail, and that had certain sort of SLAs that Post Office were expected to hit, in things like segregating your mail correctly in a branch. So it was mainly related to that sort of data and sort of targeting outbound call interventions to branches to kind of coach them to improve performance.
And I think you're still at the Post Office.
Correct, yeah.
What level within the company have you reached?
I guess sort of, lower senior manager, I guess, in more recent years.
Do you ever attend board meetings or anything along those lines?
No, that would be several rungs above me.
Thank you. In all of your roles, so some were speaking directly with branches on occasion, or others in analyst roles. Mm-hmm. Did you look at common problems that were cropping up and think that there was a problem with Horizon?
When I was with the MBSC, there were certainly problems that were being faced by branches which were coming through in the trend analysis. And we raised some of those to problem management in due course. I can recall, for example, raising problems on check listings, which was an area of confusion for branches. I can recall raising problems on the declaration process. So that was rather clunky and could cause confusion. And I recall raising problems on obsolete stock process as well. So various things that would cause calls to come into MBSC.
But when we talk about bugs, errors and defects in Horizon, were there any trends that you thought, hang on a minute, there's a problem here?
No, I don't think there was obviously issues in branches with balancing. That was evident on the desk. You know, we were getting a lot of calls on balancing, not just discrepancies, but just the process itself, how to work through it. But I didn't at that time think that there was any kind of particular issues with Horizon.
When you say at that time, which time was that?
When I was an internet analyst in 1999 and 2000.
So the early days of Horizon?
Yes.
As things progressed throughout the life of Horizon, have you ever thought, from what I'm seeing, there's a problem here?
I think as I kind of moved into the sort of service area in 2005, and perhaps in that intervening period, my thinking did evolve. It wasn't at that stage that I thought that the Horizon system was infallible. But what I did think was that bugs were monitored if there were issues with the Horizon system and could be identified relatively easily by Fujitsu and HSD if you referred a branch to them. It should be clear to them. So I don't think I thought that the system was foolproof, but I thought that there was monitoring in place and bugs would be quite easily identifiable.
We'll come on to talk about bugs shortly, but I'm going to start with training, and that's something that's addressed in your witness statement.
Yes.
Can you tell us what level of training did you have when the MBSC started in relation to Horizon?
I don't recall exactly. There was some training. I think either a week or 2 weeks of training, but I don't recall precisely what I personally received.
Were you provided, do you think, with more or less training than sub-postmasters were provided?
I think postmasters, if I recall correctly, had 2 days or a day and a half. So on that basis, I'd have to say that we had more, yes.
Would you have expected MBSC advisors to know their way around Horizon as well as or better than sub-postmasters?
Yes.
You've described in your statement the training of sub-postmasters in what you describe, I think, the early to mid years of your career as having gaps. Can you tell us briefly about those, please?
Yeah, I think this is just a reflection on my experience on the desk. I mean, we moved from a situation with the regional helplines where, calls tended to be quite short. Even on balancing after Wednesday afternoons when the branch is balanced, there was not really too much of a discernible spike in calls. But when we moved to MBSC and the rollout of Horizon, we did start seeing not just more calls, but longer calls that took considerable kind of diagnosis to get to the bottom of it. And therefore, that leads me to conclude that there were some weaknesses with the training. My own personal view at that time was that we had underestimated the sort of step change that branches were going through. This was a considerably different kind of automated environment that they were operating in when they've been used to a paper-based system for years. So that was my view at the time. And those are things that were escalated up the chain as well.
Whose job within the post office would it have been to plan for that kind of event?
During the implementation of Horizon?
Yes. So the weaknesses that you have identified, whose job was it within POL to make sure that those didn't occur?
The implementation team.
And who in particular?
I think it was led by Don Gray at that time.
And you said in the early to mid years of your career, what period are we talking about where you have identified gaps in the training of sub-postmasters?
I think it was clear to me that there were gaps during the rollout of Horizon. But I don't think we've got everything right since then. That's what I'm claiming. I think there were still gaps, and we've made improvements even in more recent years, in the last 3 or 4 years, in areas that I believe improve the sort of training offer to postmasters. So I think there's been sort of gaps around the sort of, particularly around balancing the diagnosis of discrepancies and rectification of discrepancies. For a good few years.
Horizon began 99, 2000, so are we talking a decade, longer?
I think things improved after Horizon in terms of the training offer, but I still think the sort of diagnosis of discrepancies is, that area in particular did need improvement, and as I say, we have improved things in the past 3 to 4 years. So I would say I'm happy with where it is now, but between the rollout of Horizon and say 4 or 5 years ago, I would have been less happy. I should make the point here as well that after sort of 2005, I wasn't sort of directly connected with the help desk or the training area. So these are just kind of my personal perceptions.
You've said in your witness statement that there was an additional optional classroom session of investigating discrepancies. Do you know when that came into force or was brought in?
I believe 2020.
So again, that's one of the measures that you're talking about, that it's improved the position in more recent years.
Yeah, because I moved back into the training area since 2020, so I'm kind of more familiar now with some of the improvements of the last few years. There may have been improvements in the intervening period, but as I say, my perception has been, given that we still had to produce or implement that investigating discrepancies course in 2020, that there were still gaps and still things that needed to be improved on.
One thing that you've said in your statement is that there's still less classroom training nowadays. Can you expand on that briefly?
Yeah, so when I joined the post office, I think I had 3 to 4 weeks training in classroom. That was alongside postmasters and people going to work in Crown branches. And that has been scaled back over the years. Now, some of that has been replaced with digital learning. So there is a chunk of digital learning that you do nowadays before you go to the classroom. And there is the additional sort of investigating discrepancies course that we have as well, and on site as well, 6 days on site. But yeah, I think there's no doubt that it has been scaled back over the years.
Is that for cost reasons or for some other reason?
I think it's the digital offer has obviously replaced the need to be in classroom for some of that. As to what the sort of rationale behind it was, I wasn't connected to those decisions, so I couldn't really say whether cost was a factor or there were other rationale.
You raised it in your statement. Have you raised it elsewhere within the company?
Not. I mean, I only came into the training area in 2020, so it wasn't in my sphere, as it were, in the sort of previous years.
Can we look at poll 000-35756, please? This is a document that you mention elsewhere in your witness statement under a different topic, but I just want to talk about this in relation to training at the moment. It's a document that has the words compliance training in the left-hand side, and it's dated the 25th of March 2016. Do you know the background to this document at all?
Yeah, I believe this was part of the Business Technology Transformation Programme, as it says there. So this was looking at various improvements to Horizon, of which compliance training was one.
If we look at page 18 of this document, I just want to draw to your attention a couple of entries in a table, the top table on page 18. It says there, Project Sparrow recommendations. Do you know what Project Sparrow is?
I believe that it was a project within Post Office looking at discrepancies and ways to identify them. I think in terms of this particular document, it was the Project Sparrow was providing information, as I understood it, on ways that the system could be adapted to prevent branch mistakes or discrepancies.
Have you had any direct involvement with Project Sparrow?
Other than their input into the documents as reviewers now.
The issue identified there is postmasters do not have enough access to enough training to feel competent in running their branch. Where training has taken place, records have not been kept consistently. The rationale for change, POL need to be able to demonstrate training across the network and maintain robust training records for branches and branch staff. This is 2016. Is this a broader reflection that postmasters don't have access to enough training, or is this specifically relating to compliance? It certainly seems to be broader than simply the issue of compliance.
My take on this is that it is relating to compliance specifically, not least because it is in a document about compliance training, but I think considerations for front office on the right there does refer to compliance training.
Is it your belief that in 2016 there was or wasn't some thinking within the post office about the sufficiency of the training that was provided, more broadly?
I'm sure there was, but I wasn't party to those discussions around the broader considerations around training.
I'm going to move on now. That can be taken down. Thank you very much. To the issue of advice and assistance. In a couple of the roles that you've set out for us, you were advising branches to some extent and assisting them directly. Can you tell us what roles they were and the level of your involvement directly with branches?
Yeah, so in the MBSC, as I've already mentioned, as an incident analyst, you would sometimes be called upon by a Tier 2 advisor to support with a call that they were dealing with. So that was in both my stints within the MBSC, so from 1999 to 2001 and from 2003 to 2005, I would have fulfilled that role. Wider than that, in the network coordination advisor role from 2005, I would occasionally speak to branches. So this, as I mentioned earlier, we would deal with sort of escalations from the service line where, for example, transaction corrections needed chasing up. So I'd deal with branches directly with that. And then sort of from 2010 to 2016, when I was in those data roles, but that was with the branch standards team, so we were making outbound calls to branches about those various compliance issues. So occasionally I would interact with branches on those as well.
Can you tell us your view of the adequacy of support concerning issues such as balancing in the early years of Horizon?
Yeah, I think speaking about the period when I was on the help desk on the MBSC as an incident analyst, I think it was a very difficult and challenging environment for the help desk. We were, I think I mentioned this in my witness statement, we were resourcing in line with the Horizon rollout, and we were trying to resource to a central location, so that meant that whereas the previous regional helplines would have had, typically, the route into the previous regional helplines was through the Crown network, so you kind of worked in branch for a number of years and then you went on to the regional helpline. We were recruiting and resourcing much more a broad mix of individuals. So there was a steeper learning curve for some individuals if you'd not had that branch experience. And we were obviously dealing with new contractual relationships with Fujitsu around the HSD and the scope of that help desk. So I think it was, we were going on the learning journey to some extent with the branches as well. It was tough.
You've also referred in your witness statement to booklets and guides, and you say that they didn't provide branches with adequate tools if they followed the steps, but those steps led to unexpected results. Do you recall that?
Yeah, I mean, there was a couple of different communications and guides that the branches had access to. I think the one that I particularly remember was the Horizon System User Guide, which had a load of sort of flow charts in of various kind of processes that the branch was supposed to follow. And the feedback, at least the branches that I spoke to about those guides, was that they just preferred to speak to somebody on the help desk because they found them very difficult to navigate. I think the quick reference guide, I don't remember when that came in, but there was a kind of abridged version that kind of gave you the basic steps, particularly around balancing, was much more favourably received by branches. But certainly I would say that the guides were in a lot of ways quite complex to follow for branches, and the preference was to pick up the phone and speak to the help desk.
But one thing that you specifically highlighted in your witness statement relates to following the steps that are prescribed in a guide, but even following those steps leading to an unexpected result. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Was that a common scenario?
Yeah, I think it is that it was basically because the when you came to a position where you were trying to balance, and perhaps you had a discrepancy, a loss or a gain, it was not always easy then to backtrack and find out where that had arisen. And as I say, the sort of branches, at least that I spoke to, then preferred to just get on the phone, and rather going through some steps which seemed to confuse them, they would just get on the phone and speak to the help desk instead.
Moving on to Horizon Online and help with that, I think you've said that it has its own help system. Can you tell us briefly about that?
Yeah, so prior to Horizon Online Help, if my recollection is correct, there were guides in the branches, counters operations manuals. So these were physical instruction guides, operational guidance. Horizon Online Help sort of digitised those and introduced a help mechanism that was available from the Horizon counter. So you could press a button on Horizon if you were stuck with something and look up the process.
When was something called Online Help, I think? Is that the Horizon Online Help?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And when was that introduced? Was that from the beginning of Horizon Online or later?
I believe it was from the beginning in 2010.
And you've said in your statement that although that was a step forward, it hasn't evolved. Can you help us with that, please?
Yeah, so this was mainly in sort of reflecting upon a later project that I was involved in 2016, which was to look at improvements to that very help system. And although it was a step forward in terms of digitising content, it meant that you didn't have to have people manually updating operation guides in the branch. I don't think that's been taken forward in the sense of providing easy and quick access to help. So the help's there, the content is there on Horizon, but it's about the speed at which a postmaster or branch can access it, particularly if they have a customer in front of them, and the fact that you kind of have to step out of the transaction that you're doing to kind of access the help, rather than there being a kind of overlay of that help that pops up in the corner.
And is that still an issue?
It is at the moment, yes.
And who currently is responsible for that?
I believe it is being looked at as part of the replacement for Horizon.
And who in particular is responsible for that?
The programme that is looking at the replacement for Horizon.
Is there a particular individual in charge of that programme?
Well, it's sit under Zdravko in post office terms.
Thank you. Can we look at poll 000393959, please? And it's the second page of that. It seems that in 2017 there were efforts to simplify balancing. Can you tell us briefly about that, please?
Yes.
Sorry, the second page of that. Thank you. That's
Yeah.
an email from yourself. Who's it to, and what's the issue there?
So there was a program within Post Office at this time called STRN, which was, I think, simpler to run network. And part of that was to look at were there ways that we could simplify the balancing such that it was quicker and easier for postmasters. So I was involved in the sort of very early scoping of this program, gathering feedback from stakeholders. And I think we investigated 3 areas, which were suspense account, ATM balancing, and also the general sort of balancing steps. And this email is to Alison Clark, who worked, I think at the time, as an MBSC team leader. And I was trying to gather information. We were trying to gather all the collateral together, essentially, all the documents that we had on the sort of balancing process. And this email was to gather that information from the MBSC.
Is there, within the post office, around this period, a general recognition that balancing was too complicated and that there were issues with balancing?
at least in terms of my exposure to it, that was the kind of premise behind looking at balancing simplification.
Was there any reflection within the Post Office earlier than 2017 that that was something that should be simplified?
And not in the roles that I was involved in.
Do you perceive that there has been a change in attitude within the Post Office with regards to balancing and simplifying balancing?
I think there has been a shift, but I don't think it's not led to material changes in Horizon Online at present.
I was going to say, as a result of this email, have you seen any significant material changes in simplifying the balancing process?
Not the balancing process itself, not that I recall. I think some things have been taken forward. So, for example, the ATM balancing process, I think, has had 2 stages of improvement since this document was written, this email was written.
If we turn to page 1 of this document, and it's the bottom of page 1, there's also reference to a discrepancy diagnostics document. So it's the bottom of that page. Oh, there, thank you. Is this something you're aware of?
Not to my recollection, no.
Thank you. What was EUHSP?
That was is that the help? You maybe just help me with a document.
Thank you. You can have a look in your witness statement if you like. At the beginning you provided. It says that enhanced user help and support program.
Yep.
Is that something you're familiar with?
Yeah, so that was part of the BTTP program, which was looking at enhancements to Horizon in sort of 2016.
And did that go ahead?
The help specifically, the help and support?
Yes.
No, it didn't.
And why not?
So part of the process for all of those initiatives was to present to a senior user forum of what the costs and benefits of that particular change would be. In this case, improvements to help. And it didn't get through that governance forum. It wasn't signed off by that governance forum.
And who's in charge of that governance forum? Do you know?
I believe at the time it was Jill Tate.
From the look of the emails that I took you to and reference to EUHSP, etc., it looks as though there was some thinking in 2016, 2017 about how to provide more help to sub-postmasters. Are you aware of any concrete, significant projects that have gone ahead along those lines?
I don't know whether, I think it was to provide quicker help to postmasters, not necessarily more. I think, as I said, the content is there. I think it's just about the way that they access it. In terms of things that have changed that help postmasters, there has been some changes in more recent times. For example, Branch Hub, which is a kind of digital hub that postmasters can access, has access to resources, knowledge articles, videos, and the like, downloadable guides, which are also available on the learning management system that we maintain. But in terms of help itself, the Horizon Online help, I'm not aware of any significant changes to that content.
Thank you. I want to move on to the known error log. You've addressed the known error log in your witness statement. I think you've said that your recollection is hazy. Can you tell us what your recollection is of the sharing of the known error log between Fujitsu and the Post Office during your involvement in those matters?
Yeah, I don't think I can really go beyond what I've said in the witness statement, which is that there was a lot of activity at that time to try and improve the working relationship, operational relationship between MBSC and HSD to prevent, for example, calls being bounced between those two help desks. And my recollection is that as part of that, there was some information sharing between the two help desks of issues that the MBSC were aware of and issues that Fujitsu were aware of in terms of HSD. And the known error log was part of that information share. I believe it was a spreadsheet, as I've said in my witness statement. I don't know whether that was a full set of error logs or whether it was a subset, but I do recall seeing a spreadsheet when I was working on MBSC.
So this is 99 to 2001 or thereabouts?
No, I would say it was later than that. I think in my witness statement. So it probably, I mean, this is speculation because I don't remember specifically, but it feels like it was in the later period when I was at Network. So this would have been 2003, I think. Around about that time.
So 2003 onwards, how long were you in that role? You were in that role until 2005, so 2003 to 2005, or did it extend beyond that? To the best of your recollection.
I'm not sure, given I left the role, I don't know. And I don't know how frequently it was shared.
At the end of that period, there's something called the calendar square bug, and I'm going to move on now to the calendar square bug. That first presented in October or September 2005.
Yep.
Do you recall how you first found out about the calendar square bug?
From the service manager who'd been speaking to the branch.
And who was the service manager?
Sandra McKay.
Can we look at FUJ 000-83812, please? When you say Sandra McKay was the service manager, what do you mean by service manager? Can you tell us a little bit about that role, please?
Yeah, so I think I explained earlier that in the early, sort of 2005 or thereabouts, the retail line did split, so into sales and service. So the sales managers would deal with generating sales and coaching on sales in the branch. Anything else that wasn't sales was referred to an area intervention office, and they had various service managers who worked out of that area intervention office, and Sandra McKay was one of those. So this was dealing with any issues that were not directly related to sales, and they would contact branches or they would go out and visit branches to investigate and resolve those issues.
Were they in charge of particular regions, or was it all centralised?
The area intervention officers themselves were in designated regions, but it could be any of the service managers that went out to a particular branch from that area intervention office.
Do you remember Sandra McKay being in charge of any particular region?
I don't.
So there's mention there of Calendar Square, 7th of October 2005. Can you tell us, what is this log? Because we're going to see a few of them.
This is a standard log that was completed by service managers for any interactions with branches. That might be a visit, it might be a call.
And what would happen to those logs?
They would get stored against the branch record on the electronic filing cabinet, I believe it was called.
Can we go to the second page? I'm going to read to you a little bit from that entry. It says, expand on any letter requested. So this is the entry on the log. It says, telephoned Alan, I think Alan is the sub-postmaster, as requested. He is concerned that he has still not heard anything regarding the loss that he is rolling. I told him that I had now involved the C and SM. Who was C and SM?
I don't remember what the job title. Maybe contracts and service manager. I think that would be Sandra's boss.
Thank you. Who in turn has contacted Andy. Who is Andy?
I think Andy Bayfield.
Thank you. And what was his role?
I think he was the sort of regional service manager, so he would have been the CNS and SM's line manager.
I agreed that I would make some inquiries and let him know my findings. I discussed this with Andy, who has agreed to send another email relating to the shortfall due to the Horizon failure to Shaun Turner. So why are you being mentioned there?
At that time, I was in the network coordination role. So if there were issues, not necessarily related just to issues with Horizon, but any sort of issues that required the input of other stakeholders within the business outside of service, it would be referred to myself or one of my colleagues to kind of chase up or escalate.
Chase up or escalate with who?
In this particular case, it would typically be, well, it depends. If we could resolve the issue through Fujitsu taking ownership and fixing the problem, it would be that route. If we felt it was a wider or more significant problem, then we would raise it through to the problem management team.
To who, sorry?
To the problem management team.
And who is in charge of the problem management team?
Not sure at this point. I think it was later Dave Hulbert, but I don't know at this particular point in time.
And after your name's mentioned there, it says, meanwhile, the office should continue to roll the loss. Can you explain to us what roll the loss means?
Yeah, my take on this is that it means not bringing the loss to account while it is investigated.
Was that common advice that the MBSC or others gave to sub-postmasters if there was a problem?
I don't know about the MBSC, but I don't think it would be uncommon for a service manager to advise that while something was being investigated.
And typically, how long would somebody roll the loss for?
I don't think there was some specific period of time. It would depend on how long the investigation takes.
And if the investigation takes quite a while, might it be that a sub-postmaster is asked to roll the loss for quite a significant period of time?
It could be.
Can we look at FUJ 000838815, please? Sorry, that's the same document, isn't it? Can we look at FUJ 000836664? Now, this is a significant email chain, and I'm going to start at the back, so I'm going to start at page 6 of that chain. Thank you very much. So we're here on the 11th of January 2006. It's an email from Sandra McKay to yourself. What was your position at this time?
I was still in the network coordination role.
Thank you. I'm just going to read that email. It says, you may recall that in September, the above office had major problems with their Horizon system relating to the transfers between stock units. So September, that's the reference really to the document we've seen just now, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And we're now in January. The sub-postmaster has reported that he is again experiencing problems with transfers, 5th of January 2006, which resulted in a loss of around £43,000, which has subsequently rectified itself. £43,000, would that have struck you as a significant sum, or was that typical?
An alarming sum, I would say, yeah. It would have struck me as significant.
I know that the sub-postmaster has reported this to Horizon Support. Horizon Support, who was that? Was that Fujitsu or was that yourselves?
No, I take that to mean HSD.
Thank you. Who have come back to him stating they cannot find any problem. Clearly the sub-postmaster is concerned, as we've just spent a number of months trying to sort out the first instance, and he doesn't want a repeat performance. He is convinced that there's something wrong with his Horizon kit. I'll be grateful if you could investigate this and give him any support that you can. I'm due to visit the office tomorrow to have a look at the paperwork, and discuss the situation with him. Why were you in particular being contacted about this problem?
Firstly, because it had happened before. and it appeared to be a system issue. And if it was a system issue, it was important to get that, give that visibility to the problem management team.
When you say a system issue, do you mean a wider problem than an individual branch, or?
Not necessarily, but a system issue, an issue with the Horizon system not functioning as it should.
Rather than, say, a hardware problem?
Yes. Yeah.
Could we scroll up and look at the email above? This is an email from Brian Trotter to yourself. Who is Brian Trotter?
I believe at this point he was Sandra's boss, so the CNSM that was referred to earlier.
And he says, further to Sandra's email, I visited the branch with Sandra last week, and the sub-postmaster provided clear documented evidence that something very wrong is occurring with some of the processors when carrying out transfers between stock units. To be absolutely sure from our side, can we either carry out a thorough check of the alleged faulty processors or swap them out? Can we turn to the email above that, please? So that's page 5. And we have here your response. Sorry, your email to Gary Blackburn.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned Gary Blackburn. Who was he?
Gary Blackburn was in the problem management team in Post Office.
And you're forwarding the issue to him, and you say there, Gary, need your advice on this branch. There appears to be an ongoing problem at this branch with transfers between SUs causing a receipts and payments mismatch. This first came to my attention some 3 or 4 months ago when the branch was chasing up an error notice to account for a loss, etc. Can we look at the final paragraph there? It says, since then it appeared to have happened again, although Fujitsu are saying no issue could be detected. I'm concerned that there is a fundamental flaw with the branch's configuration and would be interested to know how FS, that's Fujitsu Services, is it?
Correct,
yes.
yeah.
Put the first issue to bed. So what did you believe you were doing in that email? Were you escalating the matter, raising it with somebody who would speak to Fujitsu, or what was the purpose?
I was trying to firstly understand what was happening in the branch, and I thought Gary would be able to assist me with that because he had contacts in Fujitsu that I didn't have access to. And secondly, I'm trying to get to a position where we can fix this for the branch, given it appears to have happened in September and then repeated in January.
Could we scroll up, please, to page 4? There is an email from Liz Evans-Jones to Gary Blackburn. Now, Liz Evans-Jones seems to be from Fujitsu. Is that somebody you were familiar with?
Only in passing, but yeah, I believe she was a Fujitsu problem manager, so sort of Gary's counterpart.
So she would be a direct person to speak to in relation to a bug in Horizon?
For Gary, yeah.
For Gary. And she says there, hi Gary, I've checked the call and this issue is scheduled to be resolved in S90. S90 has already been deployed to the data center and counter release is scheduled to start on the 4th of March 2006, due for completion 14th of April 2006. Now, that response is sent to you. Why were you being kept in the loop in relation to this issue?
So that I could keep the service manager in the loop and therefore the branch.
Did you at this stage think that it might be a wider problem than just this one branch?
Not at this stage. I had no reason to suspect that.
Could we scroll up to page 3, please? So we have there, Shaun, S90 fix for this problem. In the interim, TC correction will have to continue. Let me know if you need any further assistance. And then we have an email from yourself to Gary Blackburn saying, Gary, thanks for looking into this. A couple of questions occur. Do we understand why this particular branch have been having problems, or are there any branches in the network that have been having this problem? Can the branch be front-ended on the counter release of S90 such that it gets a fix as soon as possible? The email from Liz suggests there may be a recurrence following S90. What degree of certainty do we have that it will definitely be fixed? I mean, you've said that the amount, the £43,000, is a alarming amount of money. Were you concerned at this stage about recurrences?
I was concerned to make sure that the S90 release was going to fix it. And I was concerned to make sure, as indicated by my question there, that this was, as I believed it to be, a single branch that was having this problem.
Can we look at poll 0008198, please? And it's page 6 that I'd like to begin. Thank you. This is an email from Anne Chambers. Who was Anne Chambers?
I believe that she worked within Fujitsu on their second or third line support.
Yes. And Mike Stewart?
I don't know who Mike was.
And this is the 23rd of February 2006. And this email isn't copied to you originally, but it is subsequently forwarded to you. Have you seen that?
I have.
Yeah. I'm going to read to you briefly from Anne Chambers' email. If we could scroll down slightly. It says, haven't looked at the recent evidence, but I know in the past this site had hit the riposte lock problem 2 or 3 times within a few weeks. This problem has been around for years and affects a number of sites most weeks. And finally, Isha say they have done something about it. I'm interested in whether they really have fixed it, which is why I left the call open. To remind me to check over the whole estate once S90 is live. Call me cynical, but I do not just accept a third party's word that they have fixed something. Further down in that email, she says, please note that Kells tell SMC that they must contact sites and warn them of balancing problems if they notice the event storms caused by the held lock, and advise them to reboot the affected counter before continuing with the balance. Unfortunately, in practice, it seems to take SMC several hours to notice these storms, by which time the damage may have been done. Were you aware of this problem at the time, the significance of this issue?
I don't recall reading this email. I mean, it was copied to me, so I may have seen it. I certainly didn't pick up on the significance of it at the time. My main focus was getting the branch or branches that were impacted as this fixed, which was going to be done shortly through the S90 release.
Having heard about the Calendar Square incident and the £43,000, having thought that it was likely to have only related to one particular branch, I mean, might this not have struck you as quite concerning at the time and something really that should be raised to quite a significant level within the post office?
I regret not being more curious about the line where it is said that it is affecting several sites a week. But I think at the time, if I'd have read that, I would have assumed that this was being managed through the sort of cross-domain problem management space, especially since Gary and Lynn were on the circulation.
But you had been on the distribution list of this, and you were also copied in or sent emails in the early days. I mean, dating back to 2005, you were involved in the Calendar Square incident. Is there a reason why it didn't strike you at the time as something more significant?
I think, as I say, my focus was to make sure that the branch issue was fixed. I was being told that that would be done as part of the S90 release. My accountability, therefore, was to push that forward to the service managers so that they could keep the branch up to date. In terms of this particular aspect, I would have expected that to be being, the wider sort of branch impact, if there were other branches that were being impacted by this error, to be managed, and monitored through the problem management process.
It says at the bottom there, please note that Kells tell SMC that they must contact sites and warn them of balancing problems if they notice the event storms caused by the held lock. Do you know how event storms would be noticed?
I don't. I mean, that's the other thing about this email. It has some technical content that was beyond my ken.
Do you know what an event storm is?
I don't.
How, at this time, did you believe a bug such as this would be known to the wider post office community, whether it's branches or within post office itself?
So at this time, my assumption was there were two processes that would surface a bug like this. One would be receipts and payments mismatch messages in the branch, and the other would be Fujitsu monitoring.
Was your belief that Fujitsu monitoring was infallible?
Not infallible, but I thought they had robust monitoring in place, and if a branch contacted them, they would seek to replicate that, and if it wasn't included in their existing monitoring processes, it would be added.
And if a branch didn't contact them because they didn't know about the problem or didn't connect the dots, how would they have found out about the problem?
Yeah, that's a fair point. I don't know. If there's no monitoring in place and the branch doesn't contact them, it seems to me that they wouldn't know about it.
If we scroll up to page 5, we have the email to yourself from Gary Blackburn. It's the top email on page 5, please. Thank you. Sent to you on the 1st of March 2006, Shaun, it appears that Calendar Square is not alone with its mismatch problem. It also appears that Fujitsu are expecting S90 release to resolve this quirk. We've opened a cross-domain problem record. Lynn Fallowfield is the contact. Who is Lynn Fallowfield?
She was a colleague of Gary Blackburn's in problem management.
Thank you. So it's not just a matter of Anne Chambers' email being forwarded to you amongst a large distribution list or anything along those lines. I mean, it is being sent to you as the sole recipient by Gary Blackburn, telling you here that Calendar Square isn't alone with the mismatch problem. Again, I mean, would it not have struck you as significant?
As I say, the key thing for me was getting the branch or branches that were impacted, the situation fixed. And I was being told that that would be implemented with the S90 release. And as I previously mentioned, my feeling at this time was that Fujitsu had adequate monitoring in place to identify these branches.
But weren't you also being told by Fujitsu, that is Anne Chambers' email, that she's a little sceptical of the fix?
Yes, yeah. I would expect post S90 monitoring to be in place to prove that the fix had worked. That was normally part of the standard problem management process, in my experience.
Was it your experience that somebody from Fujitsu would put in an email that they were sceptical about their own fix?
I'd not seen that before. I don't think I ever saw it again.
Can we look at page 4, please? There's an email from you to Sandra McKay and to Brian Trotter. And you say there, as you can see from the email below, though, there is now recognition that this is a wider issue than just a software quirk at one branch, which means it's now being actively managed as a cross-domain problem within Fujitsu. Why were you sending the email to them?
Predominantly so that they could update Calendar Square.
So we know that this problem has been going on at Calendar Square since September 2005. We know that the software release S90 is going to take place in April 2006. but we know that there are concerns about it still existing after the software fix. We know also now that it affects more than one branch. There seems to be in this chain a bit of a lack of urgency with regards to this particular problem. Would you agree with that?
I think things could have been done quicker, yeah.
Were, as far as you're aware, messages being cascaded across the network to branches about a problem that affects balancing?
Not to my recollection, there weren't, no.
Who was responsible for passing the information to branches that didn't call the helpline?
Once something like this was accepted as a problem, the problem management team would consider what communications were required both to internal stakeholders and to branches. So I would see it as their accountability to make that judgment.
I mean, we're talking about a problem that's gone on for years, and that, as you have said, I mean, in the Calendar Square case, £43,000, significant sum. Who do you think in Post Office was responsible for making that message more widely known?
As I say, I think that would be the problem management team.
So that's a team. Who in particular?
I'm not sure who was heading up that area at this time. But whoever is managing that problem, in this case Lynn Fallowfield, in consultation with her seniors, would need to make that judgment based on the number of impacted branches and the likely fixed time.
Did you ever have a conversation with her about it?
Not to my recollection, no.
Who was responsible for telling auditors about this problem?
Again, I would see that coming through the problem management team. They should be considering internal stakeholders and branch communications.
Who was responsible for telling investigators and prosecutors about this problem?
Same.
Were there policies and procedures in place for them to have raised the issue with auditors, investigators, prosecutors?
I was never part of the problem management team, but I believe there were processes that they could follow to determine who they should be communicating to. That was my understanding as an outsider to that team.
As someone who had spent a considerable part of your career analysing data and analysing trends, was the issue that was being raised here, so more than one branch, number of years, was that something that you would have considered to be significant?
Yeah, I think in the moment, yeah, it's significant, which is why I was asking those questions. But I think I would have seen it. You know, I think from the documentation that we saw earlier, the email was suggesting that the S90 release was imminent in March of 2006. So that would have been my focus at this time to get the branch situation fixed.
So I think the software fix wouldn't be complete until April 2006. It's been going on, at least from the Calendar Square incident, since September 2005. Did you consider the historic position, looking back, even if it is soon to be fixed, albeit a couple of months' time, what about all those branches that were affected over the course of that year?
As I say, I would have expected that to come through Fujitsu monitoring and be raised. If there were incidents earlier than Calendar Square, I would have expected that to have been monitored by Fujitsu and raised as a problem by them earlier. I had no reason at that stage to believe that wasn't happening.
Raised with who?
So the Fujitsu problem management team should raise it to the POL problem management team across the main problem.
Can we look at POL 000700134? We're now on the 6th of December 2006, and there is an email, the subject of which is Calendar Square Urgent. You are a recipient of that email from Mandy Talbot, Dispute Resolution. And she says there, in February of this year, you wrote to Gary Blackburn and he wrote to Shaun Turner and then Sandra McKay about these branches, which had apparently registered complaints about the Horizon system. Fujitsu have told us that in respect of Calendar Square, that there was a problem when the stock was transferred from one stock unit to another, but this would only apply when there was more than one stock unit, i.e. more than one position at the counter. So it seems as though even in December 2006, you were still being sent emails relating to Calendar Square. Do you remember that at all?
Yeah, I don't remember receiving this particular email prior to getting the pack, the bundle. But yeah, I can see that I was sent the email, and I think Lynn responded with some details of those 4 branches.
And can you think of why in December 2006 you would still be being sent emails relating to Calendar Square?
I think it is because there was previous correspondence between Mandy Talbot and Leslie Joyce, where the visit logs were sent, and I presume from the content of this email that Mandy Talbot may have seen the emails that were sent back and forth at that time, and that's why my name is on those, so that's why she's sort of sent out a sort of blanket email.
Was the Calendar Square bug still something that was bubbling away in December 2006?
Not in my world, it wasn't, no.
And do you believe it was or wasn't?
I believed it had been fixed by S90.
And did you check that it had been fixed by S90?
I don't recall checking. That's not to say it didn't happen. I would expect it as a matter of course, where I'd raised a problem with the problem management team, to be notified that it had been successfully resolved.
So you would have expected the problem management team to have kept a tab on whether S90 had fixed the problem or not?
Yeah, once they've got a cross-domain problem record, that's the purpose, is to manage that through and ensure that it's resolved or mitigated.
Given the significance, the sums involved, the length of time that it was happening, are you aware, and did you keep tabs on whether any significant investigation had taken place into whether S90 fixed it?
I don't recall doing that, but that's not to say that I wasn't speaking to Gary and Lynn about this post the implementation of S90.
Having been quite a significant issue at the time, significant in number, significant in effect, is there a reason why you can't remember whether you did or didn't?
I don't know what to say to that. I can't remember. So
was it not significant for you?
no, it was significant, but I don't remember. I believe subsequently from the GLO findings that it was fixed in S90. That's my understanding, but I don't remember speaking to problem management. I would have expected, that would have been my expected process at that time for something like this, and I can only assume that if I had spoken to him, I would have been told that it had been fixed in S90.
You had previously been responsible as network conformance and capacity manager and looked into things like error rates and conformance. Had you come across similar issues to this one in that role?
No, not really, because when we're talking about error rates in that role, it's not branch balancing issues, it's more presentational issues, or it may be not correctly sizing parcels, so it's not specifically related to the balancing process.
And how about as network coordination advisor? Were you coming across similar issues to the Calendar Square issue?
No, not typically, no. There were escalations to me about a rise in issues, but typically it was more things like engineers not being sent out on time, where I needed to chase them up. This was fairly unique.
Thank you, sir. It may be an appropriate time now to take our mid-morning break.
By all means, yeah, that's fine.
Thank you very much. So could we take 15 minutes,
Yeah.
which...
25 to 12?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Can we bring up poll 000700133, please? Now, at the bottom of this page, there is that email that I took you to just before the break. But then that email is forwarded by Mandy Talbot to somebody called Steve Parker. Do you know who Steve Parker was?
Other than he worked in Fujitsu now.
So, yes, as you say, he worked for Fujitsu, and it says that he's been copied into an email because it may be that you might have to do a repeat performance tomorrow once the FAD codes have been identified and the name of the branch is revealed, etc. The second paragraph is the one I want to draw your attention to. It says, Stephen and Richard, our legal team at court, will be doing their best to persuade the court not to allow Castleton. And that relates to Lee Castleton. Are you aware of the Lee Castleton case?
Only in passing, yeah, I believe it was Marine Drive Post Office, I think. But not at this stage, I wouldn't have been aware.
So on the 6th of December 2006, when the email that was sent to you is being forwarded, you weren't involved in the Lee Castleton case in any way?
No.
Thank you. I'll just continue that email. It says, to call the evidence because it is filed late and does not relate to the problems at his branch office. If they're successful, there will be no need to progress any further with these investigations, but as Castleton is a litigant in person, it is common for judges to be sympathetic and may allow him to rely on his evidence. If so, you'll have to pull out all the stops to investigate what, if anything, went wrong at these branches and why we can distinguish them from Mr. Castleton at Marine Drive. So it seems as though the Calendar Square case is being used potentially as an example of an issue with Horizon in the Castleton proceedings. Is that a fair interpretation, or your interpretation of that email?
That's a fair interpretation, I would say.
Yes. Were you asked about the Calendar Square bug in December of 2006 by anybody?
Other than the email we've seen from Mandy Talbot, no.
And did you know about the context in which that email had been sent relating to the Lee Castleton case?
Other than what is the content of the email, that's all I would have known at that stage.
So you wouldn't have had a conversation with Mandy Talbot or anybody else on that bottom email about why Calendar Square is being raised now?
No.
What was the relationship like between those who worked in NBSC and those who are involved in court cases, be they investigators or prosecutors or the legal team?
In my experience, rather distant. I don't recall any specific interactions with investigations. They were a little bit further down the line than where you'd be involved with MBSC in dealing with branches.
Would those in the MBSC ever be asked about common problems with Horizon or bugs, errors or defects?
Not to my recollection. You mean by investigations specifically, or?
Well, I mean, we see here, for example, Mandy Talbot and Fujitsu in correspondence about ongoing proceedings, and that relates to, or in some way relates to the Calendar Square incident. Was there ever any discussion, to the best of your recollection, with those kinds of people or anybody else involved in court proceedings and people who worked on the MBSC about bugs, errors or defects within Horizon?
No, not to my recollection, no.
I'm going to now ask you about another bug, and now we're moving on to Horizon Online. Can we look at poll 000344433, please? Before we go on to that particular bug, I just want to ask you, this is a document that concerns Horizon Online migration, and it seems to have been written by yourself, or it's got your name in the bottom left-hand corner. Is this a document that you recollect?
Only after having seen the bundle. I didn't recollect it before, but it does appear that I'm the author of it, yes.
In the first paragraph there, it says that the delivery of Horizon Online is a key business strategy in delivering some of the cost savings that underpin bringing the business back into profit by 2011. Do you recall at this stage, so 2010, 2011, there being financial pressures at the post office?
In general terms, yes. But in terms of the business benefits of Horizon Online specifically, I don't recall.
Do you recall any pressures to get on with Horizon Online following delays alongside these possible profitability issues?
Not specifically, no. But then I wasn't connected to the programme directly. I wasn't working on the Horizon Online programme.
Can we look at poll 00028838, please? And this is the issue that I'd like to ask you about. It's a receipts and payments mismatch issue. We can see that at the top. You're not listed there as an attendee of this meeting. You are mentioned, I know you're aware of this a bit later on in this document, but let's see where we get to with looking at this page. So it says, what is the issue? Discrepancies showing at the Horizon counter disappear when the branch follows certain process steps, but will still show within the back-end branch account. This is currently impacting circa 40 branches since migration onto Horizon Online, with an overall cash value of circa £20,000 loss. This issue will only occur if a branch cancels the completion of the trading period, but within the same session continues to roll into a new balance period. Is this something you recall at all at the time? So we're here now in 2010.
Yeah, this was in the additional documents bundle that I received, and I think I also saw this in some previous evidence, may have been by John Simpkins. And at that point, I did recall there being some issue that I was advised of in 2010. Specifically, I remember it because it was in the very early days of Horizon Online. But beyond that, in terms of the nature and the number of branches and what the specific underlying technical problems were, I don't remember anything.
It says below that, at this time we've not communicated with branches affected, and we do not believe that they are exploiting this bug intentionally. Now, I mean, you're somebody who spent your whole career at the post office. Are you aware of branches not being told about bugs, dependent on whether or not they are using it intentionally, exploiting it intentionally?
Only from my experience of the Calendar Square bug. I don't believe there was a wider communication on that to branches.
But it seems from the wording here that it's not being communicated because it's not being exploited intentionally, and they would only communicate if it was exploiting the bug intentionally. Do you think I've misread that, or do you think that that is a fair reading of that sentence?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable reading of that sentence, yeah.
Do you think that the post office was better at communicating with branches if, in respect of bugs, errors or defects, if the post office felt that such bug, error or defect was being exploited intentionally?
I think my experience with bugs is such sort of limited that I wouldn't want to make that judgment call more generally. I can only go on where I've been involved.
From your experience, was the post office better at communicating with branches where the post office had something to lose?
No, I don't think so. As I say, I've not been involved in communications. or these decisions, and it seems to me you're asking about what underpins certain communication decisions, which I've not been party to.
It then goes on to say the problem occurs as part of the process when moving discrepancies on the horizon system into local suspense. Could we turn over the page, please? So page 2, it talks about the impact, and it has some bullet points at the bottom of that page. The impact is the branch has appeared to have balanced, whereas in fact they could have a loss or a gain. So that's one of the fundamental issues that this inquiry is looking into. It says our accounting systems will be out of sync with what is recorded at the branch. If widely known, could cause a loss of confidence in the horizon system by branches. Again, is that something that you are aware of from your long experience within the post office, that there is a concern in the post office, certainly at this time, that by spreading the word, there would be a loss of confidence in the horizon system?
That, as a general theme, yes, I was aware of, yeah. And I would say that is the case in my experience.
And can you tell us how you got that impression?
Largely from the messaging that was coming out from the business, particularly in the sort of post-2009 period, around the robust nature of the horizon system, which does lead to particular sensitivities around any issues, any perceived issues with the horizon system.
We know in 2009 there was the Computer Weekly article, for example. Was that the driver, or was there some other driver?
From my recollection, I think it was the Computer Weekly and the early days of the Justice for Postmasters were certainly things that were mentioned in the business, and where messaging was coming out to internal staff like myself around the sort of robust nature of Horizon.
Where was that messaging coming from?
I don't remember specifically, but senior leaders.
When you say senior leaders, do you mean at chief executive level or below that?
I don't think I can say for certain, but I was a recipient of some of that messaging as it came down the chain, and my impression was that was coming from senior leadership.
And can you clarify with us, just so that we know who you mean by senior leadership?
I guess in my area it would be, a couple or 3 rungs up the ladder from my direct line manager. But I would imagine that messaging was coming from board level down.
And when you say some way up from your level, can you give a name?
I don't know at that stage. I can't remember the structure.
Board level, though, again, chief executive level?
This was my impression of where the messaging was coming from. We received it down the management line.
But your impression was it was coming from chief executive level?
That was my impression, yeah. It was a significant concern within the business, so my impression would be that would be coming from senior leaders within the business.
Potential impact upon ongoing legal cases where branches are disputing the integrity of Horizon data. Again, was that something you were aware of?
Yeah.
So you've mentioned the concern arising from, for example, the Computer Weekly article. Did you also get the impression, or were you told, that there was concern relating to ongoing legal cases?
Yeah, certainly.
Both of those?
Yes.
It could provide branches ammunition to blame Horizon for future discrepancies. Again, that's the same, all rolled up with the same issue.
Yeah.
If we go over the page, please. The receipts and payments mismatch will result in an error code being generated, which will allow Fujitsu to isolate branches affected by this problem. Although this is not seen by branches, we've asked Fujitsu why it's taken so long to react and escalate an issue which began in May. They will provide feedback in due course. Now, we saw in relation to the earlier bug that there was interaction with Fujitsu. We saw that Anne Chambers email, etc. Was that something you experienced with Fujitsu, that they take a long time to react to problems such as this?
I don't think typically that was my experience, but my exposure was very limited. If I did need to have or put forward issues for particular branches, it would generally be other people that were having the interaction with Fujitsu rather than myself.
So it wasn't something that you had direct experience of, but were you aware of any complaints from anybody within the post office about the time that it took for Fujitsu to react to these kinds of issues?
I wasn't aware of any particular issues that were flagged to me.
If we go down to the proposal for affected branches, we have a number of different solutions, and the recommendation is that solution 2 should be progressed. Let's just look at those solutions briefly. We have solution 1, alter the Horizon branch figure at the counter to show the discrepancy. Fujitsu would have to manually write an entry value to the local branch account. Were you aware at that time that that was something that Fujitsu had the facility to do, to manually write an entry to the local branch account?
No.
It says impact. When the branch comes to complete next trading period, they would have a discrepancy which they'd have to bring to account. At risk, this has significant data integrity concerns and could lead to questions of tampering with the branch system and could generate questions around how the discrepancy was caused. This solution could have moral implications of post office changing branch data without informing the branch. Were you ever aware throughout your time at the post office of issues relating to manually altering data within the branch?
Not to my recollection, no.
Solution 2, which is the one that they recommended, was PMBA will journal values from the discrepancy account into the customer account and recover/refund via normal processes. This will need to be supported by an approved POL communication. Unlike the branch, POLSAP remains the imbalance, albeit with an account discrepancies that should be cleared. Impact, post office will be required to explain the reason for a debt recovery/refund, even though there's no discrepancy at the branch. Risk could potentially highlight to branches that Horizon can lose data. Were you aware of a concern within the post office of highlighting to branches that Horizon could lose data?
No.
Solution 3, it's decided not to correct the data in the branches, i.e. post office would prefer to write off the lost. Impact, post office must absorb circa 20k loss. Risk, huge moral implications to the integrity of the business, as there are agents that were potentially due a cash gain on their system. Were you aware at this stage the significance of these huge moral implications and debates of this nature taking place within the post office?
Only in a more generalised sense about a concern, after the Computer Weekly article about the robustness of Horizon. And as I say, the messaging on that down the chain to me at least, was the system is robust, it's audited, and there is monitoring in place. But nothing in terms of this specific problem.
If we scroll down to the next page, you're aware that your name is mentioned there in an action point summary. It's
Yes.
the fourth one down. It says branch performance review, confirm with Shaun Turner any future audits for branches and any performance issues flagged. Do you know why you're mentioned there?
I can speculate or take an educated guess, which would be, at this time, part of my job role was the production and maintenance of a sort of branch profile, which had the branches for all the network in there, which was used as one of the tools to guide audits. And I suspect that this action is to check with me that there's no impact from this particular issue on that profile.
In this period, so we're talking about October 2010 or thereabouts, we know that, for example, Seema Misra, a sub-postmistress, was being prosecuted. Did anyone ever discuss with you these kinds of concerns and the potential impact that they may have on ongoing legal cases?
No.
Were you aware at this stage that people were being prosecuted for shortfalls on Horizon?
I was aware that there was a business process to do so. But yeah, in terms of direct involvement or interactions with those individuals in the business that were pursuing those cases, I didn't have any contact with them.
We saw from the Castleton case, for example, earlier on, an email that had been sent to you being forwarded in the context of legal proceedings. Were you aware at this stage that some people were raising faults with Horizon in their defence in legal proceedings?
In 2010,
Yes.
I was aware, because of the Justice for Postmasters, that that was being raised. Yeah.
We've seen earlier about your knowledge of the Calendar Square bug. Was this the time, perhaps, to have raised that issue more widely?
Perhaps, but my feeling on that bug was that had been fixed, and that the impact of it would have been monitored through the two problem management teams. So if there were concerns to be raised to wider stakeholders, I would have expected that to happen through that process.
But by 2010, you had known that the Calendar Square bug had gone on for quite a while, affected quite a few branches, a significant sum. You're now informed about an issue relating to the receipts and payments mismatch in Horizon Online. The knowledge that you had developed over those years, was that not something that you thought, actually, this is an issue now?
I don't think it's so much that. I think it is that I had a kind of institutional trust in the processes and teams that were managing these issues.
Do you think that the teams were acting in silos and weren't really communicating with each other in respect of bugs, errors and defects in Horizon?
Which teams do you mean?
Well, I mean, you often refer to other teams dealing with issues and it not being within your sphere at that time. Was that caused by any inherent problem with the structure at the post office?
I think the reason in the Calendar Square case, for an example, that I wanted to get that into problem management was that I saw them as the most appropriate people to resolve it, with the people with the expertise, the people with the contacts. So I don't think there was sort of, from my perspective at least at this time, that there was sort of institutional or process failings as such. In retrospect, I think you can make that argument, certainly.
Because there was this team that existed that you could pass over the problem to, and it no longer became your problem.
Well, I don't see it like that. I see it as passing it to the individuals who are most appropriate to resolve that particular issue for the branch.
During this period, so 2010, you were the branch standards data analyst. And in that role, you made outbound calls, I think, to branches to tackle common issues. Is that right?
Yeah, conformance and compliance issues, yeah.
Can you tell us how such calls would be made? What was the process involved? Why would you call branches?
So we had streams of compliance data coming into the team. So this would be things like mails data or cash declaration data. And that was analysed by myself and a colleague, and we would identify sets of branches to pull together a call campaign based on their performance. So you'd be looking at the branches that were struggling the most with, say, oversized mails, identify those, upload them for the team, and then they would make outbound calls to the branches to do some coaching.
Was there a process of making outbound calls to branches that may be affected by bugs, errors and defects in Horizon?
Not in the team that I was in at this stage. It was conformance and compliance.
And was there a team that was carrying out, to the best of your knowledge, those kinds of outbound calls?
If there was, it would be HSD, I would say, and then further down the line, if there was discrepancies, it may well be that PMBA in Chesterfield or the contracts advisor would become involved.
But the idea of making these proactive calls, which is what you were doing for a certain type of problem,
Yes.
are you aware of an equivalent of that in relation to bugs, errors, and defects with Horizon?
Proactive calls, no. Wasn't aware of anything.
How, in your view, would an issue such as this receipts and payments mismatch issue in 2010 be cascaded down to branches? Branches that didn't know that they were affected by the bug.
Well, if a decision was made to communicate it, there was the sort of weekly counter news. I would imagine it would, or branch focus. I think it may have been named at that stage, or memo view through which is a broadcast, messaging broadcast. Those would be typically the channels down to the branch if we were going to communicate.
And what would they typically have said about an issue such as this receipts and payments issue?
I don't know. I wasn't involved in communication, so I can't say what typically the messages would say, but I would imagine it would outline the nature of the problem and advise branches on how to avoid any sequences of icon pressing that would result in that particular bug.
Taking this one as an example, if that didn't happen, would you be concerned by it?
It depends on the bug and the level of branches impacted and how robust the monitoring is to ensure that we're picking up any other impacted branches.
I mean, so we have here receipts and payments mismatch affecting circa 40 branches, Horizon Online, overall cash value of £20,000 loss. In those circumstances, would you have expected it to have been communicated via those channels that you've just described?
Yeah, as I say, I wasn't involved in the decision-making process around communications, but to me, it feels significant enough that we would want to communicate something.
And are you aware of the processes involved in how that communication took place?
As I say, it would either be through branch focus, or if it was more urgent, it would go through the message broadcast service. But in terms of the sort of process for generating that communication, as I say, that would generally come through the problem management process and then to internal stakeholders and the comms team ultimately to distribute.
I'm going to take you to an even later problem, and that's the Smart ID receipts and payments mismatch that you've mentioned in your statement. Can we look at poll 000435585, please? So this is a very late issue in the context of this inquiry. We have the date there, 27th of November 2018. Are you aware of this occurring?
Yes.
Yes. And are you aware that this was during the group litigation against the Post Office?
Yes.
Can you summarise for us, looking there at the incident detail, what issue this caused in recording transactions?
I believe it caused a receipts and payments mismatch in the branch.
And you're named there, Shaun Turner, Enhanced User Management Product Owner. Why are you named as having attended that update?
At this time, I was working on the Enhanced User Management Programme as a product owner, and that role involved taking the business requirements to the technical teams to build the solution.
Having been aware of the Calendar Square bug, having been aware of the bug in 2010, the receipts and payments mismatch issue that we just looked at, now being told in 2018 about this particular incident, were you concerned about the integrity of Horizon?
I was concerned about this bug and the impact it might have. As to wider questions about the integrity,
Were people at this meeting discussing historic issues, historic bugs?
no.
Did you, at this meeting, mention those two incidents that you had previous knowledge of?
Not to my recollection, no.
There are a large number of people named here as having attended, and both from the post office and also we see from Fujitsu, we see Steve Bansal, Pete Newsom. Do you remember Fujitsu people attending?
Yeah, I do remember there were Fujitsu attendees, yeah.
Do you know when the post office started raising incidents such as this with such a wide group of individuals? Was there a particular moment in time when these issues were escalated in the way that this one seems to have been escalated in 2018?
I don't know. This was my first exposure to a kind of forum like this.
Did you question why it was taking place?
Well, I knew why it was taking place. It was to drive the solution for the bug that we'd encountered in the network.
I mean, you have quite significant people from the business there. Angela van der Bogard we've heard about, and others. You also have the head of legal, Roderick Williams, attending this meeting. Did it strike you as surprising that an incident was being raised among such a significant group of people?
Not considering the business context at the time, no.
And what was that context?
The ongoing GLO proceedings.
Do you think it would have been helpful to have had meetings of this sort involving senior individuals within the post office and Fujitsu discussing earlier incidents, the type that we've discussed today?
In hindsight, yes.
Do you know by this stage, so as late as 2018, how this incident was being cascaded down to branches?
I don't recall specifically the communications to the branches, but I believe there is mention of communications to the branches further down this document.
Perhaps we can look down page 3. There's mention of impact there. As of 22nd of January 2019, 19 branches are impacted. Impacts are confusion for the user, transactions accounted for against the wrong BP/TP, calls into contact centres from users' branches impacted, remedial action required by POL to resolve cases. I mean, are you aware of there being a significant effort to notify branches that may not know that they're affected by this incident, that it is a known incident?
In terms of the sort of branches that were identified by Fujitsu, there was a specific process to contact those branches, discuss the cause of the issue in the branch, and rectify any accounting issues.
And in terms of branches that hadn't been identified by Fujitsu, was there a way of notifying them of this particular incident, an incident that presumably has an effect on the cash balancing?
As I say, I think further down in this, I think it's this document, there is mention of a wider communication to branches that were on Smart ID at this point. I don't recall the content of that communication.
We can scroll down if you like.
Yeah, sorry, the top of that page, the BAU impact.
So, contact centres, minimal impact. Live service desk, minimal impact. Finance service centre, minimal impact. Transaction correction team are contacting branches to ensure accounts balance. Do you know if that is affected branches or those that are known to be affected, or do you think that's contacting branches more broadly?
I think that is the branches that are impacted, but there is some documentation that I have seen. Apologies, I can't find it at the moment, but it is one of these Horizon issue management reports where it mentions wider communications to branches that are on Smart ID. I think I provided a later version of this particular report. Could we bring that up?
We may not need to. I can ask you a very broad question, which is, are you aware, as at 2018 or as at now, of a policy being in place within the Post Office that if you get a significant incident that affects cash account balances, that is distributed widely across the network to as many sub-postmasters as you possibly can, as many branches as you possibly can?
I'm not aware of a policy to that effect. I can only reflect on my experience of this particular incident, which I believe the project manager tried to manage with maximum transparency, both with internal stakeholders and with the branches that are impacted.
Can we look at poll 000378819? This is a paper that seems to have been written by you. Do you remember this paper?
I do.
If we look at page 3, we have there what seems to be the same issue. Can you tell me if it is, in fact, the same issue? It's 4.3, receipts and payments misbalances, fixed September 2019.
Yeah, that's the same issue.
So it seems though the issue was fixed a year after that earlier paper, so it took quite a while to fix. Do you remember it taking quite a while to fix that issue?
Yeah.
I'll just read that for the record. It said multiple login functionality allowed a user with the same Horizon ID to be logged in at more than one terminal, providing only one of the sessions was active. Fujitsu identified in cases where an SU or office balance was initiated in those circumstances, then it could cause receipts and payments misbalances in the branch, which had been corrected by a transaction corrections. These issues were fixed by the Horizon release in September/October 2019, which put in place further controls on multiple logins related to stock unit and branch balancing and changing stock units. Now, you have in your witness statement, it's paragraph 282 of your witness statement, listed a wide range of people who were kept in the loop about this particular issue. Mm-hmm. You said that Esther Harvey sought to ensure various internal stakeholders were informed. Who is Esther Harvey?
She was the project manager for the Smart ID or Enhanced User Management Programme.
And why was she responsible for ensuring various internal stakeholders were informed about this issue?
That was part of her role as project manager.
And which stakeholders do you have in mind when you refer to informing stakeholders?
The Smart ID project team itself, in the first instance. So that would have been myself and my colleagues that were working on the Smart ID project. Angela van den Boogaard, Julie Thomas, who was the project sponsor, the relevant parties in the FSC, which was the Financial Service Centre in Chesterfield, who would be dealing with any rectification of accounts. So that would kind of be broadly the ones I'm thinking of.
And how high up within the Post Office was this receipts and payments misbalancing issue known, 2018, 2019?
At quite senior levels, I would say. I mean, Angela van den Boogaard was certainly quite senior and involved with the GLO.
Do you think it went above her?
I couldn't say.
And what was the relevance of this particular issue to the GLO?
Well, because the GLO were looking at Horizon issues, bugs, defects, and obviously this was a defect that was causing impacting accounts, branch accounts.
And can you remember any conversations with anyone in management within the Post Office about the significance of this issue in that context?
Not that I had, no.
And are you aware of any conversations that others had?
Not in terms of the content, but I'm aware that conversations were held with Julie Thomas and Angela van den Boogaard, and of course they were on the weekly calls that we were having to track and monitor this, which is sort of documented in the reports that we brought up earlier.
You say in your statement at paragraph 296 that this is an example which shows that the Post Office's management of Fujitsu was lacking. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
There was, when this happened, not least because we were going through the GLO at the time, there was a lot of soul searching within the team about how this had occurred and whether we could have done anything to identify it. And at least from my perspective, I felt that these kind of issues, given that the functionality that led to this was a significant change to the way that user management was managed on Horizon, I personally felt that this should have been flagged to us as part of the impact assessment of those changes, such that we could have avoided these issues.
And have you reflected on previous bugs, errors and defects that you've identified or been involved in, and whether in those particular cases there were issues with the management of Fujitsu?
I think particularly since the GLO findings and being aware of some of the points made in those cases, I would say yes, we weren't finding out about bugs quickly enough, in my view. So yeah, I would agree that following reflection, there should have been better management of Fujitsu.
And you say you weren't finding out about them enough or quickly enough. Whose responsibility was that on either side?
As I say, my understanding is, in terms of the incident management and problem management processes, is that it should be flagged through that route where there are issues with the system. It should be raised as a cross-domain problem and managed with communications going out to branches as appropriate.
But raised by who?
Well, in cases where the branch is aware of it, the branch, or from Fujitsu themselves through their monitoring. So it should be raised by the branch to Horizon System Help Desk, and then by Fujitsu across the post office if it's something that's going to impact multiple branches.
Has that improved in recent months, years?
Well, I can only go on the experience that I've had with the Smart ID bug, and I did find in that particular case that Fujitsu were very quick to react. They did a lot of work in terms of identifying not just the scenarios that had caused issues in the live estate, but also other potential scenarios that could potentially cause issues in the live estate from the same sort of functionality. So, yeah, my experience was that was improved if you looked back compared to something like the Calendar Square issue.
Was there a marked shift of any sort following, for example, the group litigation or since the beginning of this inquiry?
Well, my exposure has been through, sort of very limited windows where I have been dealing with bugs. So I can only say that compared to the Calendar Square, my experience of working with Fujitsu collaboratively to resolve the Smart ID EUM bug in 2018 was much improved. And we had a good working relationship with Fujitsu at that time. I found them very helpful. As I say, there was documentation produced that identified all of these various scenarios that could potentially cause the receipts and payments mismatches.
I'm going to move on now to a few discrete issues. I won't be very long with them, but they're ones that I've been asked to raise with you. The first is the transaction correction process. And can we go to poll 000399024? You've dealt with this at paragraph 137 of your statement. This is a document from October 2007. Can you briefly tell us what your involvement was in issues concerning transaction corrections?
With this particular document, I think I stated this in my witness statement, my colleague, Nikki Barraclough, wrote the document. I'm listed as a contributor here, and I believe that my contributions were predominantly reviewing the process flows in the document, and also the reporting that are in the appendices, the spreadsheets that we use to manage deductions from remuneration.
Thank you. I'm just going to take you to two passages in this document. The first is on page 2, and it's the bottom of page 2. Timeliness of issuing transaction correction. It says the time taken to issue transaction corrections can be slow, including some cases where it's taken 2 years to clear the ledger. Not only does this delay the time taken to recover outstanding debt, but it also leaves the sub-postmaster feeling frustrated that they're being notified to rectify a mistake that they may not remember, or where the evidence has been destroyed that would support a dispute to the transaction correction. This is 2007. Is this something that you remember? An issue that you remember?
Yeah, I remember concerns about the length of time it took to issue transaction corrections.
And looking at it from 2007, was that a historic issue at a particular point in time in 2007, or something that continued after this document had been written?
I don't think it was any different, in my experience at least, before this document. There were always issues that branches would raise about the length of time it was taking to create and issue transaction corrections to them. I think some of it, from my recollection, was tied to getting information from clients, which often had sort of long lead times. But yeah, it's not an issue that suddenly appeared in 2007.
If we go over the page to page 3, there's another section on disputing the transaction correction. And it's the first paragraph there that I would like to ask you about. It says the current process for disputing transaction corrections allows the sub-postmaster to challenge the error at every stage of the process, even after pressing the button on the Horizon system to settle the debt centrally. This delays the process in recovering any outstanding monies and can be used as a deliberate delaying tactic in order for the delay to delay making a payment or making payment. Is that something that you remember?
Not specifically. No.
The mention there of a deliberate delaying tactic, do you recall a culture within the post office to assume that sub-postmasters, assistants and others were up to no good or using particular tactics to delay payments?
No, not to my knowledge, no.
Thank you. A totally different topic, the PING project. Can we look at FUJ 000919292, please? Very briefly, because you have dealt with it in your witness statement, what was the PING project?
The PING project was a way of improving the accounting for third-party terminals, for example, the Camelot lottery terminal. Before the PING project was implemented, branches would have to key their transactions into the lottery terminal as they were doing lottery sales and so forth. And then they would go and key that into Horizon for accounting purposes. What the PING project sought to do was remove that human input by harvesting the transactions directly from the third-party terminal, e.g. the lottery terminal, and send those over to Horizon as transaction acknowledgements.
Thank you. If we turn to page 5, you're listed as a reviewer in respect of this particular document, or
Yep.
yeah. And if we look at page 9, there is the background. I just want to briefly take you to that background. It's the second paragraph and down. It says the client data is uploaded into POL-FS and compared with the equivalent HNGX data, which has to be manually input by the agent/counter clerk. Ideally, the data, when compared, should be the same, but a number of conformance issues have been identified where agent/counter clerks do not perform end-of-day routines correctly, do not input the Camelot details into HNGX as they should, and can key incorrect figures, leaving product and branch accounting with a reconciliation difference. This difference may require the issuing of a transaction correction. Can you tell us what a conformance issue is?
In this particular context, I believe it means either not inputting the lottery figures into Horizon at the end of the day, or inputting them incorrectly, such that there would be a mismatch.
And in terms of non-conformance, is that something that the Post Office generally understood would happen?
Yeah, I mean it's reliant on the postmaster in branch keying figures correctly.
And to what extent do you think the Post Office put too much emphasis on conformance issues rather than, for example, bugs, errors and defects? Historically or...
Yeah, I mean, I was involved in a team that was managing conformance for a number of years. And I think in retrospect, there certainly should have been more focus on bugs and issues and the management of those bugs and issues. But it was still important to manage conformance. We had contracts with clients, Royal Mail being most notable, that if we didn't achieve certain levels of performance, we were financially penalised. But in terms of the balance between those two things, I think an argument can be made that we should have put more emphasis on bugs and defects, certainly.
Thank you. And my final issue is IBM, who you've mentioned in your witness statement. Between December 2015 and March 2017, you were business readiness lead, and that involved working with IBM to replace Horizon. Do you know why the Post Office wanted to replace Horizon at that stage?
I think it's just old technology, and it was time to move on to something that was quicker to develop, easier to develop, so that new products could be brought on more easily. That was the sense that I got when I joined that program.
And do you know why IBM was chosen for that?
I wasn't party to those sort of contractual discussions. I don't remember anybody talking to me about what the options were and whether there were other alternatives that we'd looked at.
Do you know why the decision was taken to withdraw from that project?
I wasn't directly involved, but I did hear suggestions that there were concerns over cost, and there were concerns over whether it would be deliverable to the timescales we needed it to be. I think this was not just a simple changeover like Horizon Online, where we were introducing new software. It was hardware, data center, and the front office as well. So it was a considerable challenge.
Thank you very much, Mr. Turner. Those are all of my questions. I think Mr. Steen has some questions. Mr. Whittam, no. So I think it's just Mr. Steen. Oh, and Ms. Page has a question as well. But we'll start with Mr. Steen.
So I'm grateful. My learned friend Mr. Blake raised the question, sir, this morning of disclosure. And I'm just going to pause to note that on the 14th of February of this year, we wrote to the inquiry concerning the difficulties with disclosure, and indeed concerning the difficulties that the lack of disclosure of scripts and other documents were going to be causing us with putting forward questions for this witness, Mr. Turner. So I'm going to ask that that letter be resent so that it goes directly to you, sir, and therefore you can see how it is that we frame matters at that date. That wasn't the first time, sir, that we've raised issues regarding scripts. And with that as a starting point, I'll now move to my questions for Mr. Turner. Mr. Turner, as you've heard from Mr. Blake and indeed myself, there have been some issues regarding disclosure that may inhibit our ability to ask you some wider questions. And that could cause, therefore, a need for you to return to the witness box at a later stage.
Okay.
Now, I'm going to just refer you to your own statement. I'll read a part of it. At paragraph 12, page 5, you refer to your role to analyse the data arising from calls to identify trends and common experiences and common issues experienced by sub-postmasters.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you call yourself a data analyst? What would be the term that you would use?
At that time, it was incident analyst.
Incident analyst, right. Now, help us on the other side of the calls from the sub-postmasters. You were aware at that time that Fujitsu also had their own help desk taking calls.
Yes.
We know that because indeed you've spoken today about the fact that some calls were taken by the post office team and some were taken by Fujitsu. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Right. Now, the analysis of common issues experienced by sub-postmasters, that job would need to be shared, I assume, between the post office and Fujitsu.
Yeah, so both help desks should have had an incident management framework in place that included analysis of calls coming in, trends, and I would expect that if system issues were coming through, common system issues, that would manifest in HSD and be raised to their problem management team if appropriate.
Now, within that answer, you used the word should and words I would have expected.
Yes.
In relation to those sorts of systems. Now, clearly you can give evidence about the post office systems. What knowledge did you have at this time about the Fujitsu equivalent systems?
I'm trying to remember. I know there was documentation that showed how Fujitsu should manage incidents and track common themes. And that would have been the basis from my knowledge. My sort of layman's view of it was that they would be replicating something very similar to what we were doing in the MBSC. In other words, they would have some kind of data team that was looking at trends. I didn't have any direct contact with their own incident analysts myself.
That was going to be my next question, which is how are these things tied together? If it wasn't tied together at your level at that time, at what level was it tied together, and who can you direct us to who should be able to know how these things came together?
There were forums at our level where common issues were discussed. I didn't have any direct contact with their equivalent of the incident analyst, but there were forums between the help desks. But I would imagine if there were common themes coming through, these should have been raised through the problem management process and then managed at that level between the two problem management teams. And then there was a service management forum as well, where the two parties met to similarly discuss problems.
The numbers of calls in terms of working out numbers of calls coming into the post office help desk versus Fujitsu. Can you give us an idea whether this was an even spread of 50-50 that came into the post office versus Fujitsu, or whether it was more post office or more Fujitsu? Have you got any?
I'm sorry, I don't recall the numbers or the sort of volumetric data at this stage.
So just remaining with this question, you've explained that there should have been something operating in a similar way by way of incident analysis with Fujitsu.
Yes.
Did you see documents that would have provided the other side of the coin, the Fujitsu side of the coin, and your documents synthesized, put together so that you've got a picture? Did you see such things?
Not to my recollection, no.
Were there such things?
I don't know after this amount of time. There were forums where common issues were discussed, so there was some interaction between the two help desks, and we tried to resolve issues, operational issues, through those forums as well. But I don't remember seeing specific documentation other than what I've referred to in my witness statement.
And just before I then ask you a little bit more about how documents were kept, shouldn't have been documents that provided a combination of these are the issues we are seeing within POL, and these are the issues we're seeing within Fujitsu, and they are showing similar issues being raised or similar problems or good things or indeed bad things. Shouldn't such things have existed? And shouldn't they have come to you?
Yes, yeah.
Now, you've remained at the post office for quite some time. Indeed, I think it's essentially your career so far.
That's right.
You describe in your statements, the analysis work that you carried out in relation to incidents. Can you just help us with access to the analysis that you've carried out? There must be, going back now to the early days of Horizon and then through, there must be hundreds of these documents that you've created or been part of the creation of. Where are they?
What type of documents are you talking about?
Well, let's go with the analysis of the MBSC call operator performance, as an example, or trends within difficulties being experienced by sub-postmasters. Where are these documents?
I don't know at the moment. There certainly were reports produced. I know where problems were raised off the back of those reports. They were logged in a system that we used at that time called Remedy. Which was...
Did you say Remedy?
Remedy,
Oh,
yes. Which was both the incident management tool and also the problem management tool. So that's where the calls were logged. And any problems that were raised to the problem management team were also logged in there with the originator.
We've encountered some problems with terminology being used. So scripts for the help desk are sometimes called other names other than scripts.
Right.
Okay, so just help us identify the analysis work that you had been carried out. So this is analysis of to identify trends and common issues experienced by sub-postmasters. What would have been the title, or what would be the title of such analysis reports?
It would be an incident analysis report on topic X.
Right.
And if the problem was raised, it would be a problem record on that topic.
And do you have access to systems that contain this documentation?
I don't.
Help us, why not?
The passage of time, I've moved through various roles since then.
Have you been asked by either the post office or lawyers on their behalf regarding your knowledge of access to this material, where it might be?
No.
Despite the fact that you're the author of such documentation over time?
Yes.
Now I'm just going to just complete this particular topic range. Oversight of the help desk. This is the Fujitsu help desk.
Yes.
Now, you would expect, I imagine, that Fujitsu should carry out its own oversight, governance, operation regarding help desk. Okay. Who within post office monitored the Fujitsu's oversight of its own help desk?
The service management team, I think, from recollection.
Management team.
Yeah.
Right. And a particular name of an individual that you would recall at any given time? Or
At any given time, somebody like Dave Hulbert would have been heading up that team. That's where I believe the monthly service management reviews were managed.
There's a term used, which is used within your statement and referred to in a document that you were taken to today by Mr. Blake, which is a cross-domain problem.
Yes.
Okay. Is that a term of art within the post office to describe a type of document or report or system where there is a problem that is known to both Fujitsu and the post office?
It's terminology to describe any problem that requires interaction with a third-party supplier, i.e. it's not just within post office gift to resolve.
Right. Is there any sort of risk analysis system that has been developed to decide when such a thing does reach the stage of it being a cross-domain problem? So is there a trigger for this to say, look, this is cross-domain?
There were problem management documents around prioritisation and so forth in terms of issues.
Right. And risk analysis, similar? Were the documents around that considered risk analysis in the way that traditionally regulators often do, thinking about either using a traffic light system like green or amber or red to analyse risk?
I don't recall specific documents, but I do remember conversations with problem managers about rating problems based on the number of branches impacted and so forth.
Thank you. And I've got one remaining question. You were asked a number of questions by Mr. Blake regarding the receipts payments mismatch issue.
Yeah.
And he referred you to a document, which is a Post Office Fujitsu document, that discussed that. That's the receipts payments mismatch issue. He referred to that around the period of time which is 2010 and ongoing. One thing that is unclear from your evidence so far is what were you actually told about that issue, the receipts payments mismatch issue, at around that time? What were you told about it?
I don't remember. I remember being told that there was an issue, having seen the document last week.
Yes.
But I don't remember exactly what I was told, whether the nature of that conversation was just, as per the action point out of that meeting, can you check whether this will cause an issue with the profile that I managed at that time, the branch profile. But I'm sorry, I don't remember what I was told.
I'm grateful, Mr. Turner, because your evidence was clearly hesitating. You were hesitating your evidence at time regarding this. And so it led to these questions, which is, what access did you actually have to this information? You referred to that as a conversation. Was it actually a discussion, an oral discussion, or was this an email discussion or some other means of discussing it?
As I say, I don't remember. I'm using sort of conversation in a more informal
Yes.
context. I don't remember whether it would have been somebody dropped me a note saying, can you look at this? I would hope, if it was, that we'd be able to find the documentary evidence of that. But it may very well have been a phone call.
Yes. And if I ask whether you recall being briefed, in other words, being given a written document, Mr. Turner, this is something you need to be aware of, this is the issue, we want you to do X action. Do you recall getting anything like that?
Sorry, I don't.
No. If someone were to give you send you such a document, which team would have given you that kind of heads up or that information?
Well, I think considering that the action listed was against Julia Marwood, who was an attendee of that meeting, I would imagine any interactions that I've had, and if there was an email trail, I would imagine that would be from Julia to me.
Yes, because she's listed as being the owner of that particular issue under her initials JM.
That's right.
Yeah. Excuse me one moment.
Sure.
So I'm grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Page, I think, has a question.
Thank you, sir. In your witness statement, Mr. Turner, you note that because of a baseline faith in Horizon as a robust system, Pol was perhaps not as attuned to concerns raised by SPMs as it should have been.
Yes.
Can I just ask you about that when you were in your role when the Calendar Square bug was brought to your attention? I don't know if you're particularly aware of this, but in Scotland, it was a rather different prosecutorial process, and Post Office were not allowed to bring their own prosecutions. Were you aware of that?
I was not, no.
Well, what we've obviously got here is a Scottish problem with a Sandra Mackay picking up the issue in Calendar Square in Falkirk. It was first noticed then in Scotland.
Yes,
That makes sense.
it does.
Did you ever receive? What I'm interested in is the possibility that people in Scotland were more attuned to the problems that sub-postmasters faced because their experience of having to deal with third-party prosecutors may have made them more attuned, if that makes sense.
I never received or had a conversation to suggest that, no.
Did you ever receive any problems like the Calendar Square bug type problem, or indeed problems generally? Did they ever come across your desk from area managers working in England and Wales?
I don't recall any specific instances, but I would expect, yes, there were cases from England and Wales. My role, in terms of that escalation role, covered the entire country, so it could come from any area of the country.
You described earlier in your evidence that the Calendar Square problem was perhaps somewhat unique. What was the qualities of it that made it unique?
Unique in my experience,
Yes.
at least.
Yes.
I think it was, in terms of my exposure, I'd not come across anything like that previously. I think I said in my witness statement that of the issues I dealt with during my time as network coordination manager, I didn't remember the details, but I still remember that I dealt with this particular bug at Calendar Square.
And do you not particularly have memories of other bugs that you dealt with?
No, I remember other issues with Horizon and other parts of the business, but this to me would have been an unusual and anomalous kind of case, at least in terms of my exposure to it.
So in terms of your exposure, bugs of this nature were not raised to you at all from England and Wales?
No, I'm not saying that I didn't have some issues raised, but I think I don't remember whether there were issues raised from England and Wales, but I would expect that there would be.
But they didn't stand out in your mind as a significant problem in this way, in the way that the Calendar Square bug did?
No.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Ms. Page. Is that it, Mr. Blake?
I believe that is, yes. Unless you, sir, have questions.
No, thank you very much. Mr. Turner, I'm very grateful to you for providing such a detailed witness statement in response to very many questions. And I'm equally grateful that you come before the inquiry to give oral evidence. So thank you. I should say that in view of the fact that, as you will have gathered, there appears to be a glitch in the disclosure process, it is not inconceivable that you will be asked to return, but we'll keep that under review, all right?
Okay.
Thank you.
So, shall we say 10 to 2?
Yep, by all means, Mr. Blake, yep.
Thank you very much.